So your issue, something basic, can plaintiff obtain damages and or an injunction against the defendant based on the tortious injury of public or private nuisance? So you can kind of include what it is that the plaintiff is seeking for, damages up here in your issue. And then your rule, you want to put your general rule of public or private nuisance, very, very clear. And then, if there's other rules that you have that might apply, specific rules that apply to the specific fact pattern, then, you want to include those. And then you have your factors. And obviously you want to list those out under the rule section. So for your analysis, obviously you want to apply your facts to the law. And let's say, for example, you'll have a private nuisance and you're analyzing, a couple of elements. We said there's like about 3. So you want to first talk about whether there is an interest in the land by the plaintiff. Let's say there isn't. You still want to go through all the analysis. You don't want to cut it short and say, oh, well, because there's no interest in land, therefore, blah, blah, blah. No, Hall wants to see you go through the full analysis, even if they're not going to recover, just for the sake of analyzing it, for the sake of proficiency. So then you would go into substantial harm, and then you would go into whether it was intentional, whether it was negligent, or whether it was abnormally dangerous. And the way that I kind of did it was, if you look right here, well, this is for factors, but I did this for the factors as well. I would underline a section and do a little colon, and then I will talk about whatever the element or the factor was so that I could break things up in my analysis section. Because, there were a lot of like moving parts when analyzing, nuisance. So something like this, or you're just clearly separating things to make sure that you have organization, and also just to keep track so you're not missing anything and you're hitting all the points. Obviously, you want to talk about if there are, what are the remedies? Are there any privileges? And are there any defenses? And then you conclude and you go on your merry way. So I will say, I do think that it's my opinion that you guys will probably get something about nuisance on the final exam. So this will be helpful for you. And that is that. Again, you guys are going to receive these slides, so not to worry about a thing if you don't catch everything right now. And moving on to defamation. So defamation, libel and slander, they make up defamation, right? So libel is a statement which is in written or printed form, and slander is a statement which is made orally. And then an example of, well, sometimes a statement can be both libel and slander. So that can happen. An oral statement can be libelous as well as slanderous if it's spoken to a large enough audience. The case on point for that was Shore v. Billingsley, where an ad lib on a national radio broadcast was held to be libel. The broadcast of defamatory oral statements is just as harmful to one's reputation as a defamatory written statement. So here's your prima facie case of defamation. These are all the elements you would need to hit in a defamation fact pattern. If you're analyzing defamation, even if you're talking about New York Times v. Sullivan, you need to hit all these elements and do a whole analysis. So defamatory statement of and concerning the plaintiff, publication, fault, and harm. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through each of those elements and then provide further define those elements. So for a defamatory statement, you have Restatement Second of Torts, Section 559, which is on point. And that section says, to be defamatory, a statement must have a tendency to harm the reputation of the plaintiff. So some things to keep in mind right here that kind of inform whether something is a defamatory statement or not. So it's not necessary that the plaintiff's reputation is harmed in the eyes of all or even most people, but rather it is sufficient that the reputation is harmed in the eyes of some. That's the Grant v. Reader Digest case. And another thing to keep in mind, the plaintiff doesn't necessarily have to show that the defendant intended to refer to that particular plaintiff. So I provide an example. It's possible to defame someone by using a made-up name, which turns out to be someone's actual name. So to be a defamatory statement, it doesn't need to be, the defendant or media defendant doesn't need to specifically intend to refer to that plaintiff that's suing, right? This is an example of one that happens. You can use a made-up name. It turns out to be someone's actual name. It harms their reputation in some way. What else? So if a statement is susceptible to several interpretations, the statement is defamatory if any one of those interpretations is one which a reasonable person might make, and the plaintiff shows that it was understood by a reasonable person to have a defamatory meaning. And then last but not least, you have libel per quad, which the comment section under Restatement Second up towards 563 talks about. And that section or that comment says, defamatory matter may be communicated by innuendo, by figure of speech, by expressions of belief, by allusion or by irony or by satire, or by words spoken in jest, if not so understood. So there's many ways that you can say something that makes it defamatory, or write something that makes it defamatory. And that is a defamatory statement. So moving on, of and concerning the plaintiff. So what you want to keep in mind is that the plaintiff must show that the statement was about them and that it was reasonably interpreted by at least one of the recipients as referring to them. The case on point for that was Bindrum v. Mitchell. That's the case where a character in a book was reasonably interpreted by several witnesses to be a reference to Dr. Bindrum, a psychologist who ran nude therapy sessions, and the publication was libelous regardless of the fact that the plaintiff's name and appearance were altered in the book. So, reasonable interpretations, that counts. And where a large group is defamed and no one in the group can sue even though the language used is inclusive, but where a small, or so those people, they can't sue, but where a small group is defamed and each member is referred to, then each individual member can sue. And the Neiman Marcus case is the case on point. That's the case where 30 out of 382 saleswomen working for Neiman Marcus were defamed as call girls. And in that case, a reasonable person couldn't conclude the defamatory statement referenced any individual salesman, but where 15 out of 25 salesmen working for Neiman Marcus were defamed as fairies, the reference is to such a large portion of such a small group that it's sufficient to establish a defamation claim. You can kind of single out certain people. And that's of and concerning the plaintiff. So that's what you need to just show that either there was a reasonable interpretation, it had to do with that specific plaintiff, even if the defendant wasn't specifically naming the defendant, like in the Bindrum case, or wasn't specifically naming the plaintiff, like in the Bindrum case. And then for publication, pretty simple. Any communication of the defamatory statement to a person other than the plaintiff is considered to be publication, and the defendant's publication must have been either intentional or negligent, right? Either intentional or negligent. Very straightforward. And then in this case, like, you wouldn't need to go and do like a full-blown negligence analysis. It's enough to briefly speak about like somebody's duty and, you know, whether they kind of caused harm, right? Like a full-blown analysis. It's kind of just do what you need to do with the time that you have. Okay. And then for fault, also pretty simple. The plaintiff has to show that the defendant was at least negligent in making the defamatory statement. Intent to defame a plaintiff is not necessary. So the elements of publication and fault are kind of similar, and you might have some redundancies there, but they're separate elements and you want to give each one, you know, an analysis. All right, and then the last element is harm. So for libel, under the common law, there was, you know, no special harm was required to be shown because damages were presumed. And then historically, so the reason for that is historically there was potential for substantial harm to someone's reputation because, let's say, a pamphlet at the time when pamphlets were being published, those could be mass produced and therefore they had a long life, whereas oral statements had a short life. So libel at common law, which is, written statements, damages were presumed. When it comes to slander, you need special harm. So that's coinciding with Restatement Second of Torts, Section 558. And that section says that the plaintiff may generally establish slander only if they can show that they have sustained some special harm. And special is usually required to be of a pecuniary nature, so some kind of financial loss or something related to that. And then slander per se, there are specific exceptions where no special harm is necessary. You don't need to show any like pecuniary nature or anything like that. So those examples are crime, where the statement is imputing criminal behavior to the plaintiff, loathsome disease, for example, an allegation that the plaintiff currently suffers from a venereal disease or other loathsome and communicable disease. This is actually very interesting given that we are living through a pandemic and, hopefully, we're coming around to the end of it, but that is a pretty interesting exception right there because it applies today. So then you have business, profession, trade, or office. So an allegation that adversely reflects on the plaintiff's fitness to conduct her business, profession, trade, or office, that doesn't require her to show any kind of special harm. And then last but not least, sexual misconduct. But this one doesn't really apply anymore because of its inapplicability in today's society. So that one is there for reference, but it's not really favored anymore. So that's harm. And then we'll talk about privileges. So privileges, absolute privileges. So for example, judicial proceedings, judges, lawyers, parties, and witnesses are all absolutely privileged in what they say during the course of a judicial proceeding, regardless of the motive for their statements, but the statement must have some relation to the matter at issue. So obviously, judicial proceedings, you're privileged in what you say. You can't really sue for defamation based on what happens in a judicial proceeding. Similarly, in legislative proceedings, legislatures acting in furtherance of their functions and witnesses before legislative proceedings are absolutely privileged in what they say during the course of legislative hearings. Government officials, including all federal officials and some state officials, depending on what jurisdiction you're coming from, they all have absolute immunity from defamation liability as to statements issued during the course of their duties. So very specific. So it has to do with statements issued during the course of their duties. And then husband and wife, a marital relation, or any type of marital relation, husband, wife, any communication between a husband and a wife, or a wife and a wife, or husband and husband is absolutely privileged. But if a defamation originates with a third person and is relayed by one spouse to the other, then this repetition will still be a publication and the third person will be liable for the harm caused by it. So whatever you say between spouses is privileged, but then once a third person comes into that, then that third person could be held liable for defamation because they're not part of that spousal privilege. And then you have consent. Any publication that occurs with the consent of the plaintiff is obviously absolutely privileged. So if you consent to it, you can't go turn around and sue for defamation. Qualified privileges. So for protection of a publisher's interest, the defendant is conditionally privileged to protect their own interests if those interests are deemed to be sufficiently important and the defamation is directly enough related to those interests. And then public interest is also a qualified privilege. So the defendant is conditionally privileged to communicate to one who has the power to act in the public interest. For example, a private citizen reasonably but mistakenly reports to the police that someone has committed a crime. There's a public interest in reporting crime. So if harm to the plaintiff's reputation occurs, then this is an example of a privilege that the defendant could apply or could, argue. Then you have report of public proceedings. The defendant is conditionally privileged to report on public proceedings such as court cases, legislative hearings, and all that. And then you have neutral reportage, which is where some courts have recognized the neutral reportage privilege, allowing media defendant to be conditionally privileged to report so long as the media defendant correctly reports the charges, so that the only truth falsity issue is whether the charges themselves are true. And the media behaved neutrally regarding the underlying controversy, and the report is related to a public controversy. That one is a mouthful. It's a mouthful. But those are your privileges, your absolute and your qualified privileges. And then you have actually, so your major defense obviously is the truth. If your statement is true, then it's not defamatory, right? Defamation requires a false statement of some sort. So in order to support the affirmative defense of truth in a defamation suit, the defendant has to prove that the statement was substantially true. However, a statement of pure opinion is never defamatory. If you're saying something that is purely your opinion, even if it is completely wrong, then it is not defamatory, but there's an exception to that exception. If you make a statement of pure opinion that implies some kind of undisclosed fact, that implies that you know something more than whoever it is you're publishing this information to, then it could potentially be defamatory. So I am going to move on now, and I know Professor Hall talked about New York Times a lot, so I'm sure I'm just going to be here to summarize it for you, give you the relevant points that you need, and then I'm going to pass it off to Sharon because I'm spending a lot more time than I intended to. So for New York Times, this is where the actual malice standard comes from, and it applies to public officials. So your big rule is that in a defamation suit brought by a plaintiff who is a public official, the free press's right to free speech is protected by the First Amendment. And in order to prove defamation, a public official must prove with clear and convincing evidence the falsity of the defamatory statements and the presence of actual malice in the media defendant. To prove actual malice, a plaintiff must show that the media defendant published the statement with knowledge that it was false or with reckless disregard for the truth. So that's the rule that came out of New York Times versus Sullivan with respect to the actual malice standard. And if you notice, it's the standard of evidence right there. So that's kind of a higher standard than preponderance of the evidence. And the actual malice standard of the New York Times versus Sullivan case does not apply to private individuals. It only applies to public officials, even if the defamatory statement relates to a matter of public interest. And states can determine the appropriate standard of care for publishers that defame private individuals as long as it requires some level of fault. So that's your actual malice standard. And then now we're going to talk about I spelled expansion wrong, but the expansion of the scope of New York Times versus Sullivan. Okay, so actual malice. The Saint Amant case expanded the scope of the actual malice standard. So to prove reckless disregard for the truth in a defamatory statement under the New York Times case actual malice standard, there has to be evidence that the speaker entertained serious doubts as to the truth of the statement. And that's the Saint Amant versus Thompson case. And then next for public officials, although the failure actually, never mind, I still have one more under actual malice. So although the failure by the defendant to investigate the truthfulness of a defamatory statement will not alone constitute actual malice, under New York Times, if the speaker deliberately decides not to ascertain available information on the truthfulness of the statement, that is sufficient to constitute actual malice. So this first one, reckless disregard, and this is also kind of informing reckless disregard. The Hart-Hanks case. And then moving on to public officials, where whether a plaintiff is a public official is a question of federal law, not state law, and the test is held to be whether the position in government has such apparent importance that the public has an independent interest in the qualifications and performance of the person who holds it, beyond the general public interest in the qualifications and performance of all of the government's employees. That's the Rosenblatt v. Barrett case. And then the New York Times rule applies to candidates running for public office as well. And then public figures. So the New York Times was expanded to apply to public figures, including those who insert themselves in a public debate. So people who voluntarily put themselves in the public eye. And last but not least, matters of public or general interest. The New York Times knowing or reckless disregard standard of actual malice was expanded beyond public officials and public figures to apply to any matter of public or general interest. So this is kind of where the New York Times actual malice standard kind of ends up being. It really applies to any matter of public or general interest. It's very broad, covers a very broad scope. And then very quickly, for an IRAC structure, similar to what we were talking about with nuisance, you want to have your issue, can whoever the media defendant is be held liable for libelous or slanderous defamation against the plaintiff. You want to list all your elements here, and then in the rules section, let's say you get a fact pattern that has to do with public official or something like that, and you are going to be talking about actual malice. You also want to include the rule from the New York Times case and any rules subsequent to New York Times from its progeny that kind of are relevant to the fact pattern that you have. And then for your analysis, you obviously want to apply your law to your facts. And again, similar to what I was describing with nuisance, what I did last year, which helped me, break things up aesthetically and also make sure that I hit all the points. Just take each one of your elements, underline them, start writing, analyze it, and then let's say you are analyzing New York Times. So last year, I think I did just a separate analysis of the actual malice standard, separate from these elements. After harm, I just kind of went and did actual malice. But if you want to analyze it under fault, I can see how that could be reasonable. Or if you want to analyze it, fault or harm because you're talking about actual malice or something like that, I can see how that would be reasonable. So for example, if you did it under fault and you had like a little fault section right here, then I would kind of just enter and then indent and then do the same thing where I would underline it and just keep going. Just to break things up, that's kind of what I did. Then you also obviously want to talk about privileges or defenses that apply. Truth is always a defense. That's the biggest one. That's the only one we talked about. And then privileges, whether any absolute or qualified privileges apply. Then you want to conclude and you're all good to go. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I've been talking for so long. For those of you who want to stick around, you can stick around, I guess, because I know Sharon has some helpful things that she's going to share with you. So I'm done now. Goodbye.
Thanks, Rewa. So I'm just going to cover what I can based off the time that we have left. The last time I did the practice, or I did the fellow session, we went over a products liability question. I'm going to try to go through this quick because I also have another one that we can go over, but we'll see how fast this goes. So this is just a quick defamation question. So you guys can take a look at it, and then mostly I want to show you a structure on how you could potentially answer this kind of question. In an essay, like Rewa was saying, you really want to hone in on each one of the facts and the elements and make sure that you're giving an in-depth description and explanation as to why or why not the particular elements of whatever tort you're talking about have been met or haven't been met. So I'll give you guys a minute to kind of look over this and then we could talk about it. Okay, what do you guys think? So the first one is a defamation claim. Again, always remember to look at whatever the call of the question is. Um, and sometimes Hall does some things like, oh, like this element has already been met, so please only discuss this, this, and that. And my advice would always be just to reassure that statement. So if he makes it clear that something's been met, just make sure that you restate that. And that's why you're not talking about it, and then move on to whatever elements you need to. Like, just make sure you're honing in exactly on what the call of the question is asking for. So here it's a defamation claim, right? And it's like identical twins. So if we go down, the first thing you're going to look at is a defamatory statement. This is just kind of reviewing what Rewa said, except putting it into a practice essay. So, Debbie claimed that Cindy was a cokehead doing cocaine, is looked down upon, and the statement made Cindy seem like she was less trustworthy and responsible person. The statement is in fact false, which is again what you need if it's a defamatory statement, right? Because a possible defense is, oh, well, the statement's true. And because it was not Cindy doing cocaine, she had never done cocaine. Concerning the plaintiff, when Debbie sent the note to the newspaper, it said Miss Smith is a cokehead. This in itself might not be enough to satisfy this requirement of a defamation claim. However, coupled with a picture of Cindy's twin sister, who looks exactly like Cindy, it made it clear that Debbie was intending to tell the newspaper that Cindy was a cokehead. Publication, Cindy made the statement to the newspaper. A third party who understood the statement to be about Cindy based on the last name and the picture that looked like Cindy. The newspaper was unaware that Cindy had a twin sister, thus it was understood that the picture was of Cindy. Then you want to go over harm and reputation. And libel's written, so special damages not required. Debbie wrote to the newspaper, which qualifies as libel. Because the defamatory statement was in the form of libel, Cindy will be able to recover general damages for past, present, and future pain. If Cindy offers evidence of her pecuniary loss, she may be able to recover lost wages as well. And then you have slander, which is the information was transmitted by email, so it was not spoken. Make sure that you guys are going over all that. And what I meant by just clarifying things, this is a super easy, quick way to make sure that you're covering all aspects of defamation. Even if it's not there, boom, at least you're showing him that you know what slander means, even if it's not directly applicable. It's just a quick, to show that you are understanding of it. First Amendment, does the amendment apply? Well, Cindy's running for office, so there's an argument that she's a public official or a public figure. But if the court finds that she was not a public official, the fact that she was a potential drug user running for office would be a matter for public concern. This is something I really like to do too. It's really important, kind of adding in a little bit of facts to clarify what you mean and your understanding for something is always really good. And especially when you guys have open note, it's really good to put yourself above and beyond. The statement was false. Cindy was not a coke user, and the picture used was her twin sister. And defendant acted with malice, knowledge that it was false or reckless disregard for the truth. Debbie knew that Cindy had a twin sister because she went to school with both of them. Even if she wasn't sure whether the picture was Shelley or Cindy, she recklessly admitted that pertinent information when she sent the picture. And so the defenses are truth. The statement wasn't truthful, so no defense, and privilege. The statement wasn't privileged, so no defense. And then just conclude Cindy will likely be successful in her case. You can even obviously conclude a little bit bigger than this, because all of these elements have been met, Cindy will likely be successful in her case. Something that I wanted to make super clear is that when you guys are doing, because you have open note, right, you do not want to rely on it. Most of these exams are speed race, whatever they call it, they're quick. I usually run out of time for all of my exams. So please, just for your own benefit, make sure that you're not depending wholeheartedly on your ability to be able to search for all of these answers. You really want to have the elements almost kind of memorized. And then if you have your outline, you just want to be able to command and find very specific nuances within all of these elements of these different torts. So something that's oh man, I really don't remember that. You can search for that real quick. But if you're searching for each one of these, this is only one answer, right? This is a call of question for one. And if you're searching for each and every one of these, I promise you're going to run out of time and you won't get to everything. It's in your best interest to remember what a defamatory statement is. like remember just literally like what Rue was talking about and what she reviewed. Like you want to have that almost memorized. Is some of the best advice I can give you guys for the exam. I'm gonna stop sharing. I'm gonna pull up the one that I went over with you guys. It was 2 weeks ago, just to kind of show you. I verbally went over it with you guys because I hadn't like written it all out yet, but now I'm gonna show you like an example for products liability. It was that one with like the bug spray or whatever. Let me pull it up 1 second. Also, I apologize for my voice. It's going away. Okay. So this is the one I went over with you guys last week for whoever wasn't here. You can give it a quick read. Basically, it's a woman who owns a fumigation gas business and she sells directly to consumers. Most of her competitors do not sell directly to consumers because they are under the impression that consumers do not follow safety instructions. So Darla sold a container of fumigation gas to Albert for using in his apartment to get rid of insects. Although she wanted to produce gas of standard toxicity, she unknowingly produced gas of unduly high toxicity. Albert then used the gas and got rid of all the insects in his apartment, but he used the gas carelessly and it made its way to the neighbor apartment of Paul. The gas caused Paul to suffer serious lung damage and a fear that he would contract cancer as a result. So the call to the question is Darla liable to Paul? So just make sure you're really looking at that. It's not asking is Darla liable to Albert, it's asking is Darla liable to Paul? And then only theories of products liability. So these are just all things you're going to want to look at and you're going to want to talk about for this one. So there's three theories of liability, and it's like strict liability, negligence, and breach of warranty. I went over all this verbally, so I'm just gonna 2 weeks ago, but this is just like some ways in which you can like set it up. So you really want to make sure you give the general rule, and then your analysis of that rule, give all the different ways that, design defect, manufacturing defect, inadequate instructions. Again, like here, it's unclear whether there would have been inadequate instructions because we didn't get that fact, but it's something that you just want to briefly talk about if it's not something that's super clear in the fact pattern, again, to show that you understand all of the aspects of the tort. Actual causation, proximate causation is super important to talk about both in these products liability claims. And then consider defenses. You can go over like specific defenses. It really just depends on how much time you feel like you have. I would hit everything else. If there is clearly no defenses, I would hit all of the other stuff and then come back and try to like talk about why there is no viable defenses, but by all means, get all the other stuff done first. And then you have to go over, strict products liability, and then you go over negligence, and then breach of warranty claims. So like, I think that there's a chance you guys will get a products liability essay because you have to go through so much. You have strict liability, then you have, this is if Carl is liable, but it's just like a lot of information and I can foresee him talking about it. So just make sure that you guys know, like, expect like the different warranties. That's something to have really memorized, and only nuances should be what you like command find on like during the exam. Is there any like general questions you guys have? Any worries that you guys have? I know it really sucks that we can't really give you a better succinct way that he wants these things, because we really got just a golden ticket and did not have to worry about this class or any classes last semester. So yeah, just please, let me know. And again, I'm just gonna like say what I showed you are things that you have to approach. Like me and Rewa have said a lot of times, please don't ever rely to what we're saying to your detriment. Anything Paul says is always superseding us and always before us. And yeah, is there any questions? Okay, so we have, just to reiterate, please refer to Rewa's email that she sent out regarding me and her cutoff times for questions. It's April 30th at noon. And I think that's it. If you guys don't have any questions, definitely I would refer back to kind of I remember him kind of giving you guys an outline of how he wants questions answered. Try to also do that in this exam too, because obviously that's the way he likes to see things. So just cater it to the new torts that you learned, but try to format it to what he wanted and what he kind of examples he gave.
Can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
I forgot to ask him earlier, but do you think he's going to have any intentional torts on the final? Or is it going to be mostly negligence and
I don't
defamation?
foresee that happening. I mean, I can't obviously say like, oh, absolutely he won't, but there's just so much other things, new and material that you guys learned that I don't foresee it being a huge chance that he will, but.
Okay, thank you.
So your cutoff times, is it that we can email you questions only and you'll email us the answer back, or would you guys be available for like 10 or 15-minute Zoom calls to go through? Because I'm trying to read through my whole outline before the end of the week and figure out where exactly my questions are.
Yeah, so our cutoff time, it means that anything sent to us after 12 that day will not be replied to. In terms of Zoom meetings, I can't speak for Rewa. You can ask me and email me and I can see if I have a free time to do that. The only issue is I know I personally study like all day and I reply to emails like decently late. So, because we just also have our own exams to study for. So I would say that I will, if you ask me and you email me directly, I'll see if I have a slot, but like I can't guarantee it since this is dead week.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I'll also add very quickly to that, like I echo what Sharon said, and I do respectfully request that if you do want to meet with us in a Zoom meeting, that you try to get something set up before the cutoff time, because like Sharon said, we also have exams and we're trying to study as well. So if we could keep everything, to reading week, we would really appreciate that.
Anything else, y'all? Best of luck and everything.
Yeah, if you have no more questions, you're all free to go. We wish you the best of luck on your finals. And I know you'll do great. So good luck. You are very welcome. It is
You're
our
welcome.
pleasure.
Good luck.
Honestly, I'm just glad we can be beneficial.
I just think it's funny that we're even able to teach other people stuff because
Yeah.
I'm just like, this is all I got for you all. Sorry.
What's the likely chances that he can wrap everything we've learned into one essay? Because last semester was one essay.
What are the chances?
Yeah.
I don't underestimate any of the professors.
Yeah, the chances.
They're able to do it. I mean, the whole purpose is like, especially with open book, I know a lot of professors purposely make it more difficult because they're really afraid of cheating. So they really try to, like, I've had multiple classes last semester that I straight didn't finish. And I got a good grade because I'm sure that everybody didn't finish. But I'm just saying, like, if he wants to go that route, he is allowed to, and that means like really stuffing every issue he can think of in there.
Got it. I was just trying to, like, I was going through it and I was like, how do you put negligence in with defamation without changing the parties? Or how do you put in strict liability with everything that we just learned? And in the last couple classes, because he made extra classes, like, you know, he had us come in 2 Fridays to do liable, and then he did like one pre-recording that we could show up, but he didn't say we had to on like a lunch hour. And then today he spent on defamation and like really was like, you know, I'm telling you now, this is going to be there somehow. I'm like, so are you telling us it's all going to be defamation, or am I going to be stupid and like focus on just the last part, forget everything else?
Yeah, like, well, this is what you're gonna run into next year when we go back in person and you don't have the luxury of open book exams. You need to know everything.
Okay.
That's the reality of it for us. Like, you know, that's the reality for typical law students. You just have to memorize everything.
Okay.
Or in your case, you need to be able to like recall things from your mind with respect to everything that you've learned as part of your prep for the exam.
Okay, and there was one that I was like trying to go through my notes and stuff from class. Oh, what was it? You had said it. Everybody's like, we didn't go over that. And I'm like, are we sure we didn't go over that?
Vicarious liability.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem like it. I went back like several weeks into your lectures. Like, you would know if you went through vicarious liability. It's a pretty self-explanatory and obvious area of torts law. So you would have known.
Okay, so like trying to go through it and learn it right now during reading week, don't even